All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into something that I think is just so fascinating.
Right.
And that is Plato's use of myth
It's like,
within his dialogues.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
think that for a modern audience, we tend to think of myth as something that is untrue or a
right,
fiction.
right, yeah,
But for the ancient Greeks, especially in their early period,
yeah,
mythos really meant a genuine account
yeah.
of origins.
That's really interesting because I think when we think of um, the word myth, we think of it almost as like the opposite of reason or the opposite of truth.
Right.
Like it's a false story or made up story.
Exactly. And so that brings us to kind of the crux of like what we're going to be looking at today,
Okay.
is why would Plato, who is really a giant in the history of reason and logos,
Right.
weave these seemingly non-rational narratives,
Yeah.
these mytholoceanist dialogues.
Right.
And
Yeah, it's
so,
almost like a contradiction. It's
yeah,
like, why would this champion of reason
yeah.
use these stories?
Right. And we're not just talking about like a champion of reason in the abstract sense. We're talking about someone who is building on this
Right.
burgeoning emphasis on logos and logical explanation.
Yeah, he's not turning away from it. He's sort of like working with it, but also working with something else.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're going to try to today kind of tease apart what's going on there.
Okay.
And kind of distill some of the most important takeaways about how Plato uses myth
Sounds good.
within his dialogue. So one of the first places that I think is important to start is to kind of consider who is Plato's audience.
Okay.
And, what is he trying to accomplish with his writings?
Right, because we have to remember that Plato is writing.
Yeah.
And he's writing for a specific audience.
Yeah.
And Eunice makes this really great point about the nature of philosophical writing before Plato.
Okay.
And Eunice is saying that philosophical writing before Plato was much more, how do I say this, specialized. It was much more geared toward a kind of narrow
Yeah.
group of experts. And it was often about very fundamental things about the nature of reality.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
what is reality? Those kinds of questions.
Okay.
But Plato shifts gears. He's really interested in grappling with universal ethical questions. And crucially, he wants to make philosophical inquiry relevant and accessible
Yeah.
to a wider intellectual public.
Right. And so Morgan also kind of echoes this point by saying that it seems like Plato is writing for both seasoned philosophers
Yeah.
and those with a more general interest in intellectual pursuits.
So he's trying to hit both of those.
Right. And this is something that is a bit different than Socrates
Yeah.
and how Socrates engaged in philosophy.
Socrates is out there
Yeah.
in the agora
Yeah.
talking to people directly, engaging with them face to face.
Yeah.
Whereas Plato is using this written dialogue as his medium.
Exactly. And this is something that I'm sure we've talked about before, but it's so important to recognize the importance of the dialogue form
Yeah.
in Plato, because he's not writing dry, systematic treatises.
No.
He is creating these very vivid conversations. He's setting the scene. He's introducing characters.
Yeah.
He's establishing like a real context.
Yeah, and it's almost like he wants it to seem
Yeah.
as if they're real conversations.
Yeah.
Even though, of course, we know that he is very carefully shaping the argument.
Right. And it's within this dialogic framework
Yeah.
that we start to see these myths really coming to the fore.
Right.
And this happens around the Protagoras and the Gorgias, is when we start to see these self-contained imaginative narratives
Yeah.
being kind of woven into the dialogues. And it suggests that at least part of the function of the myth is to make the ideas more engaging and comprehensible
Yeah.
for those who maybe aren't as interested in like the pure abstract reasoning.
Right, right.
So this brings us to kind of the nature of the myths themselves.
Sure.
Like what forms do they take? And what are some of the characteristics of these myths? Well, there are two categories of myths in Plato. First, there are traditional myths, like stories that are already deeply ingrained in Greek culture. And examples of these would be like the tale of Gyges' ring,
Okay.
the myth of Phaethon's reckless ride, the stories about the Amazons, and what Plato sometimes does is he just adopts these pre-existing narratives and he adapts them to his own purposes.
Got it.
We also see instances where he kind of creatively synthesizes traditional elements.
Okay.
So, for example, The Noble Lie and the Republic.
Yeah.
This is a fascinating blend of the Cadmean myth of autochthony,
Okay.
which is the idea that people are born directly from the soil,
Yeah.
and Hesiod's myth of the different ages of humankind.
Right, so it's like a fusion.
Yeah, it's a fusion.
Those ideas.
Yeah, and then of course Plato was quite a myth maker in his own right.
He came up with his own.
Yeah, he invented entirely new narratives. And I think the most famous examples of this are the myth of
Right.
at the conclusion of the Republic and the story of Atlantis.
Okay.
Even within these original creations, he frequently draws upon familiar mythological tropes, like the Isles of the Blessed, the concept of judgment in the afterlife.
Right, so he's still drawing
Yes.
from the pool of mythology.
Yeah. So one of the things that's crucial is that all of these myths, whether borrowed or invented, consistently deal with realms beyond our direct empirical verification.
Right.
So we're talking about God, spirits, the afterlife, primordial events.
Right.
And this inherent non-falsifiability is really a defining characteristic.
Where they're not things that we can test, verify empirically.
Yeah. And so, they're imaginative, but there's good reason to believe that they weren't intended to appeal solely to the irrational aspects of the psyche.
Okay.
And Kant kind of touches on this point when he notes this radical discrepancy between Plato's transcendent philosophical vision and the kind of prevailing social and ethical norms of his time.
Right.
And he kind of says that myth provides a kind of literary distancing that allows Plato to kind of explore these potentially challenging ideas within a less directly confrontational narrative framework.
It's a way of getting people to think about these things without them feeling directly challenged or attacked.
Right. And what's so cool about Plato's dialogues is that it's not just philosophy that he's employing here. He's incorporating elements of philosophy, comedy, tragedy, poetry, mythology, rhetoric.
Right.
And so he's really bringing all these forms together.
A real mixture of styles.
And it seems like he's doing this to disrupt the conventional modes of thought and to encourage more independent engagement with the ideas.
Yeah.
So it's important to note here that not every imaginative narrative constitutes a myth.
Okay.
So, for example, the allegory of the cave in the Republic, while it is rich in imagery, it functions more as an analogy to illustrate his theory of forms rather than a narrative about specific beings or events in a non-verifiable realm. So thankfully, we have some scholars who have kind of helped us to think through, like, what would constitute a myth in Plato.
Okay.
And most has outlined 8 common features that can be seen as characteristic of Platonic myths.
Okay.
And the first one is that they tend to be presented as monologues by an older speaker to a younger audience.
Got it.
Second, they're often attributed to traditional oral sources. Whether those sources are real or fabricated, we don't know.
Yep.
Third, they are non-verifiable. Fourth, they derive authority from tradition rather than immediate rational scrutiny. Fifth, they aim for a psychological effect on the listener. Sixth, they are descriptive or narrative in style. Seventh, they frequently appear either before or after a section of dialectical argumentation, and of course most recognizes that these are not absolute rules. There can be exceptions, but it gives us a good kind of framework to think through what is Plato doing with myth when he uses it. What's really interesting is that Dorian actually argues that the story of the oracle in the Apology fits this profile, and he classifies it as a foundational myth for Socrates' practice of Olyncus. So it's really interesting to think about, even the origin of Socrates' method might have a mythical dimension to it. And Bell and Nosov also pointed out that, Plato makes extensive use not just of myth, but of figurative language generally. And some examples of that would be animal comparisons, illustrative examples, analogies, fables. And it's not just myth, but myth is part of this broader strategy that Plato has of using figurative language to kind of make points. So let's move on to the function of myth within Plato's broader system. Why is he strategically employing these narrative forms? And one of the primary functions is persuasion. Plato recognized that while reasoned argument should guide the philosopher, those less accustomed to abstract thought often respond more readily to narrative and imagery.
And myth has this inherent persuasive power that can effectively instill beliefs, particularly in those less inclined towards rigorous logical analysis. And this is something that he mentions explicitly in the Republic. in regard to how children should be educated.
Right.
And we see this very clearly, exemplified in the noble lie.
Right.
The purpose of the noble lie is not to convey factual information, but to cultivate a sense of civic duty and belonging among the citizens of Callipolis. And Schofield makes this interesting point, that even the philosopher rulers who have this rigorous training in reason might still need this kind of foundational myth to ensure that their patriotic obligations outweigh potentially conflicting philosophical inclinations. And some scholars even think that the preambles to laws in the laws could be seen as noble lies. Another really important use of myth by Plato is in his eschatological narratives. These are narratives that deal with the nature of the afterlife.
And some of the dialogues that have, these are the Gorgias, the Menono, the Phaedo, the Phaedrus, the Republic, and the Laws.
Okay, so a pretty significant number of them.
Yeah, and while the specifics vary, there are certain recurring themes. And these are things like the judgment of souls after death, the experience of rewards or punishments, the contemplation of the forms, and the possibility of reincarnation. And even though these are Plato's own imaginative constructions, he often draws upon figures and motifs from traditional Greek mythology. And it's really important to note here that Plato's eschatological myths aren't presented as mere fabrications. There is this kind of implicit claim to truth that often connects them to broader philosophical commitments. So, for example, in the Phaedo, Plato gives this very extensive argument for the immortality of the soul. And so the eschatological myth in that dialogue kind of presupposes that the soul is immortal. And Socrates famously says in the Phaedo that there's this noble risk involved in believing in the myth. And so it's not blind faith, but it is a recognition that there are profound truths that can be conveyed through narrative. And myth can even serve as a kind of backup for Plato. If, reasoned arguments fail to kind of convince someone to live a more virtuous life, then a myth that depicts the consequences in the afterlife might be a very effective way to get someone to pursue that kind of life. And even in the Laws, Plato suggests that myth is necessary to kind of charm individuals into agreement when reasoned persuasion fails.
So it's almost like a backup strategy.
But it is important to note that there are alternative interpretations of these eschatological myths. Sedley, for example, has argued that the myth in the Gorgias functions primarily as an allegory for moral and psychological realities within this life. And Halliwell has made a similar argument about the myth of and then Gonzalez has suggested that the myth of underscores this kind of inherent opacity of human existence that pure reason alone cannot illuminate. So there's, a lot of different ways to interpret these things. But I think it's really important to recognize the importance of these eschatological myths. And it's not just persuasion that Plato is using myth for. Another important function of myth is as a pedagogical tool. And Plato understood that abstract philosophical doctrines could be challenging to grasp and retain. And so he uses myth with its narrative structure and vivid imagery as a way to embody these ideas in a more accessible and memorable form.
So it's a teaching tool.
And a really good example of this is Plato's theory of recollection. So in the Phaedo, recollection is presented through these fairly abstract arguments. But in the Phaedrus, we get this myth of the winged soul, and we see this ascent to the realm of forms, the soul's glimpse of true reality, the subsequent forgetting upon incarnation, and then the gradual process of recollection triggered by sensory experience. So while the Phaedrus myth doesn't really give us a formal proof of recollection, that does make the concept far more intuitive and understandable. So finally we get to kind of Plato's attempt to bridge this divide between mythos and logos. And I think the cosmology in Timaeus is really instructive here. And it's referred to both as an eikos mythos and an eikos logos. So both a probable tale or likely story and a reasonable account. And so Cornford had argued that it qualifies as a mythos because of its narrative structure and because we can only really have a limited knowledge of the ever-changing cosmos. But Bernit has given us another really important interpretation, and he emphasizes the eikos aspect. And he interprets eikos not merely as probable, but also as reasonable or fitting. And he says that. The Timaeus cosmology is really trying to reveal this underlying rationality of the universe. And the the reasoned intentions of the demiurge.
So he's saying it is reasonable.
Yeah, it is. It is
Yeah.
trying to give an account
Yeah.
of the reasons behind
Right.
the creation of the universe. And he also points out that by calling it a muthos, Plato is also trying to reconcile these two modes of discourse.
Okay.
And I think this is really apparent if we think of the Timaeus cosmology as a theogony,
Right.
an account of the origin of the gods. And the cosmos itself is a divine entity for Plato.
Right.
And so, when we're talking about this theogony, we are talking about imagining the practical reasoning of the demiurge,
Right.
who's constrained by the materials at hand and who's ultimately striving to create a coherent and reasonable outcome. And it's almost as if we are the judges of this process, using our own philosophical standards to determine whether the demiurge has succeeded or not.
Right.
And we also see instances in other dialogues, such as the Protagoras, the Theaetetus, and the Sophist, where philosophical doctrines are actually referred to as mythoi. And so this suggests that there might be a non-argumentative, or maybe even a more foundational mode of presentation that Plato is employing in these cases. And while Plato famously critiques some of the traditional myths in the Republic for their potentially harmful content, he also acknowledges that the mythoi told to children can contain elements of truth. So he has this very nuanced perspective on the value of myth. And this relationship extends to his discussion of poetry in Republic 10. And there's this tension there between his critique of mimesis and a lingering appreciation for the power of poetic expression. And it's almost as if Plato recognizes that human reason itself might have inherent narrative capacities. And that there's a blurring of the lines between philosophical argumentation and mythical storytelling. And thinkers like Gasly, Rowe, and Fowler have explored this idea. And they've suggested that, just as Agbe, the rational soul, is connected to the physical body, so too, at Might Logos, be intrinsically linked to mythos at this fundamental level.